policies. And I think we've got an outstanding panel to facilitate that. Those of you that have already started the 21-day challenge, hopefully you've gotten deep enough in it to have seen the segregation by design piece by Richard Rothstein, the history of Central Park Village, and the award-winning documentary by PBS called Central Avenue Remembered, and also the incredible journalism that really propelled us forward with understanding how Tampa's first Black cemetery could be desecrated in such a way with policies, protections, and literally be built upon more than once without ever removing hundreds of bodies that was buried there. We're going to explore all of this. We're talking about race today and real estate, that intersection. I think the events of the last year and a half or so have, I think, brought us all together to have more honest conversations about the impacts of systemic racism, systemic segregation on our societies today, and the charge that we all have as real estate professionals, as a community, to challenge those systemic issues, break down those barriers, and actually build back differently. I like the new president's approach, build back better. It's coming out of a recession, coming out of our sort of COVID mode of operation for the last year. But I think we as the real estate industry can adapt that as well and build back differently than, the patterns that resulted in today's patterns of segregation. America is the most segregated country in the history of the world. And it didn't happen as a result of personal prejudices. And if you've gone beyond just segregation by design, the 17-minute video clip, and have actually picked up a copy of Richard Rothstein's book, The Color of Law, I strongly encourage you to do that, read that, because it is, to me, one of the best, most in-depth, honest discoveries of our impact on how we live today. And when I say our, I'm talking about real estate professionals. That's who ULI is. ULI has been responsible for the vast majority of my professional growth. I've been a member of ULI for 24 years or so now. And ULI has always pushed the envelope in, building differently, building better, building healthier, building closer to transportation. So you minimize, affordability challenges and improve health outcomes. And for years, ULI have been looking at all of these individual aspects of building differently. And today, I think ULI has taken it on unabashedly, the issue of systemic segregation in our society and how past practices can be reversed. And I like the way Richard Rothstein ends his segregation by design by simply saying, what can we do? It's an incredible obstacle, certainly, to undo 100 years of land use practices, of segregating populations because of race. But what can we do differently? We can acknowledge it. We can accept responsibility for it. And we can fix it by building differently, developing differently. So that's what we're going to be exploring today. This is an incredible panel. We're going to first hear from Paul Guzzo, the award-winning Tampa Bay Times reporter who broke the story of Zion. Zion Remembered, the rediscovery of Zion Cemetery. And I want to hear from him in terms of what interests him on pursuing this story. I knew how long it took him before he could actually get enough research to actually put it out there and actually run his first story. And since then, there's just been a whirlwind of discoveries, both in our own community as well as throughout the state, of Black cemeteries and cemeteries in general that was actually built on top of without ever having removed the bodies. We're going to hear from Fred Hearns after Paul, Fred Hearns is the a local historian, and he has a new title today, which is Curator of Black History for Tampa History Museum. And Fred Hearns, I've known since I moved to Tampa over 20 years ago. He's formerly with the city of Tampa and has helped me incredibly at understanding the history of our sites, because we have always wanted to understand the history of our sites before we redevelop those sites, so that we could actually understand how to both brand them and also how to build back more inclusively. And Fred has been a huge help at me personally at doing that. So Fred Hearn's going to give his perspectives as a citizen in this community, as a historian in this community, and as a member of the Zion Archaeological Committee that actually has been charting this process. And then Tim Baker is going to talk about the future of that area. Robles Park Village is our last systemic segregation era, barrack style, stigmatized public housing in the city of Tampa. It is the last site to be redeveloped, and we are now ready for that process to begin. And his firm, Baker Barrios Architects, has been selected to master plan that area, and they're toward the end of that master planning process now. So in particular, we're going to hear from Tim on how you take such a sensitive issue, put it in the community, get honest feedback from the community, and redevelop it so that it is a diverse community that serves the entire community, but it also respects the history and the past. So I think we've got a great morning available. I'm going to jump right into it by introducing you to Paul Guzzo. Paul, you can take it away now.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. So until the discovery of Zion, the city of Tampa had only one known Black cemetery that dates back to the area of segregation, and that was Memorial Park, which is still there on MLK. Woodlawn Cemetery, which is the city cemetery, has a Black section. And I point this out because somebody said to me recently, it's almost embarrassing that we never looked at the city and thought that prior to 1919, the only cemetery, every Black resident in the city of Tampa who died was able to fit into that tiny fenced-in area of Woodlawn Cemetery where Black residents were allowed to be buried. How did we not think there had to be another cemetery somewhere? Where did we think people were being buried? But one thing I learned during my research was there were always whispers that there were these cemeteries. There were people who came out and said, well, there used to be a cemetery over where Robles Park is. There were people who said there was a cemetery out in Odessa where there's now a horse ranch. There were people who said, well, there was a cemetery on MacDill Air Force Base. You can actually Google it and you will find people on the genealogy website dating back 10, 15, 20 years ago discussing this, but nobody ever wanted to take those claims serious, I think because it seemed too horrific for us to believe that there were these Black cemeteries scattered throughout the city of Tampa that were just slowly erased. I know for a while, we even the Tampa Bay Times, we were using the word lost, but I think now it's clear that these were erased. We just didn't want to believe it. And then, oh boy, how long was it? Two and a half years ago, Ray Reed, a cemetery researcher, I was doing a story on him. There's the Potter's Field, the Poor Farm Cemetery here in Hillsborough County. There's a couple hundred markers with names, but there are thousands of people buried there. So Ray Reed goes through death records, trying to find everybody buried in the Poor Farm Cemetery, a cemetery for the poor and the indigent. So when relatives are looking for their descendants, or I'm sorry, their ancestors, they can find they're buried here. So we did a story on him, this great thing he's doing. And at the end of all the interviews, he said to myself and James Borchuk, a Times photographer, he said, well, the real story is Zion Cemetery. I'm like, well, what's Zion Cemetery? He said, well, I don't know really. He's like, I keep finding these death records for people buried in Zion Cemetery. Everybody who's buried there is Black. It's from the early 1900s. So that can only mean one thing. I said, what's that? He's like, well, it's probably still there, hidden somewhere. And it kind of sounded like a conspiracy theory to me. I don't really write about conspiracy theories, but James, the photographer, was like, well, can't hurt to look into it. So we went to the library and we actually found Zion on the old city directories with an address. I sent that address over to the Tampa Bay History Center. Rodney Kite Powell pulled up old maps and he said, well, there's not a cemetery that says Zion, but you can clearly see on this map dating back to when Zion was in the city directories, it says Black Cemetery. So obviously that meant it was Zion. We did a few overlays, and then we realized, oh boy, that's under Robles Park Village. This could be bad. But you still can't just write that story, right? We found a map and there's death records. That means they're still there. So we basically spent a year trying to prove the bodies were moved. We found every death record we can for Zion. We plugged those into databases for every other cemetery in Hillsborough County. And we now know almost 1,000 people were buried at Zion. James and I found 382 death records, I think. And when we plugged 382 death records in every county cemetery database, and we couldn't find any of them, I think we found a handful that were moved. That meant, oh boy, they might still be. So we look for newspaper archives. Usually, if you're going to move a cemetery, that's something a newspaper would cover. That is a very big event. You know, people crowd around the cemetery to watch. We found newspaper articles for other cemeteries being moved, none for Zion. So that meant we felt safe running our story. And we didn't run the story saying the bodies were there. We just ran a story saying nearly 400 bodies are missing. They were buried in where Robles Park Village, some warehouses and the tow lot are today. What could that mean? Robles Park Village, the housing authority, to your credit, immediately jumped on it. And I think about a month and a half after my article ran in June 2019, the archaeologists confirmed that there were indeed still hundreds of bodies there and that Zion was not moved. Zion, to me, really visualizes or shows the racism of the city at the time. So a developer just didn't look at Zion Cemetery on a map and say, oh, there's a black cemetery. I'm going to go and destroy it and I'm going to build over it. What you have to remember is, so Zion was part of Robles Park Village, which was, they describe in the old newspaper articles, a black community on the outskirts of downtown. I think it was 4 to 5 miles outside of downtown. So they built Zion there and they built this community there because they thought they were safe from white development, right? Because the city of Tampa was this little ball here. And when they built it, they never envisioned the city expanding like this. And as it expanded and has expanded and has expanded, suddenly there were cemeteries in the way of city expansion. There were 2 cemeteries. You had the Catholic Cemetery, which is where Sacred Heart Academy was later built, and you had Zion Cemetery. Both were in the way of this expanding downtown core. Catholic Cemetery was moved. You can find the news archives. Again, like I said, when you're moving a cemetery, it's going to be covered in the newspapers. The reporters were out there. There were city meetings with the people who had loved one buried in Catholic cemetery saying, this is how we want our family moved. We need to make sure they're moved properly. They sat there and they oversaw the operation. So, and that was done in 1925. Zion was erased, or the erasure began in 1929 when they built storefronts. Why was Catholic Cemetery moved and Zion not? When I talked to historians, they said the developers would have done the same thing to Catholic Cemetery if they could have gotten away with it. Moving a cemetery is an expensive venture. But the white community had a voice. The white community was able to stand up and say, no, you're not just building over my grandparents, my parents, my aunts and uncles. You're going to move them and do it properly. Whereas the black community did not have that voice. They did not have a say. And so when nobody was going to step forward and stop developers from simply picking up the headstones and moving them, they were just able to do that. They just picked up the headstones. They built storefronts. Later on, they built some houses, and they didn't erase it in a day. They moved the headstones where they wanted to build the storefront in 1929. And then from talking to people who lived in the area a few years later, they moved the headstones behind it because they wanted to build houses there. And then finally, they were like, well, we'll just move them all. They just picked up all the headstones. And then slowly but surely, they developed over all of it. I keep thinking, people at first, when we reported on Zion said, well, is it because they were black or because they were poor? These people weren't poor. This was not a potter's field. This is not a cemetery for the poor and the indigent. These were people who could afford burial, who could afford funerals, who could afford the large services. Some of the, I keep always pointing out to people, L.G. Carl. L.G. Carl was buried in Zion Cemetery. To me, he was one of the most prominent African-American men, women in Hillsborough County at the time. You look back at archives on him. He was one of the few black pastors who could marry people. He helped found Bethel Baptist Church. He was the person you needed to endorse your campaign, if you were a white candidate running, they would run. It would be an article. LG Caro endorses so-and-so for mayor. LG Caro endorses so-and-so for city council. I can't find anybody else in the Black community who the white community sought their political endorsement of. This was a powerful man. Other people who were buried in Zion, Richard Dobyville. Richard Doby's not buried there. His son is buried there. These were powerful, pioneering citizens of Hillsborough County who were buried in Zion Cemetery. Yet, when they decided that land is in the way of development, not even these men and women had the power to stand up and say, no, you're going to stop this. Maybe they said that. We'll never know if they tried, but we know if they did, their efforts failed. And that really, I think, sums up what it was like. And over the years, it's not like Zion was built over and then forgotten. We know when the Housing Authority built Robles Park Village, they uncovered a few caskets. We know that, I think like 20 years prior to that, when somebody was digging a hole in his backyard near there to bury trash, he came upon it. And every time they would come upon these bodies, they would say, well, that's from the old Zion Cemetery, but it was moved. When they would come upon these bodies, the developers who first developed over Zion were still here in Tampa. Reporters never thought to call them and say, hey, you're the one who bought that cemetery. You're the one who sold the land. Where are the bodies? Where are the rest of them? Reporters, the city, the county just kept overlooking this. And that's why Zion, I feel is, the definitive glimpse into what the city was like at that time, and just the racism that was there. This voiceless community couldn't stand up, no matter how many times that there was something in our face saying something horrible is happening here. Nobody could stand up. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Paul. Thank you, Paul. And I know you can go on for another 30 minutes or more, but I just can't thank you enough for, I think, the way you approach this, stuck with this. We would be in the middle of master planning now, I think, having not really understood that Zion was once there. When you first came to the Housing Authority and said, I believe the cemetery, this was the site of Zion, we were understanding that as was past tense, the site of Zion. And if indeed it is a cemetery, was a cemetery there, we needed to know now, because we were a year or so away from starting this master planning process. So the first thing we did was, advance the phase 1 environmental assessment through Cardinal, our engineering company. And the phase 1 confirmed that indeed Zion was there. That was the site of Zion Cemetery. And to give it proper perspective, understand, I hope the whole audience understands that Robles Park Village is a 35-acre community. Zion Cemetery is 2.5 acres. So Zion Cemetery effectively sits beneath 5 of the 85 buildings that is Robles Park Village. So the entire community wasn't built on top of the cemetery, but 5 buildings was built on top of the cemetery. But having then confirmed that indeed this was the site of Zion, the research that Paul had did and his stories that just kept running, that just, kept suggesting that the bodies may still be there, because you could not find, reinterments, published at that time. So we advanced a second round of discoveries through the archaeological process, and we wanted to actually do the ground penetrating radar. That's the least invasive process. So let's radar the ground and see if indeed we can see any anomalies that resemble intact coffins. And once again, that came back with positive readings showing voids beneath the ground that suggest intact coffins. That wasn't proof, but that was very high scientific suggestion that, the ground has been disturbed or had not been disturbed in certain areas. So we then went through yet a third phase, most recently, which is what the archaeologists call the ground truthing, where they literally start scraping, incredibly thin layers of soil at a time to get down to the top of what is intact coffins, and actually confirmed with evidence, with fact, with photographs, that indeed the coffins are still there and the bodies are still there. And very, very few appears to have ever been removed. So that's where we are today at approaching the redevelopment of this site in terms of how to accept responsibility for that. Of course, none of us on this line was here in 1954 or in these roles, and certainly weren't here in the 1920s when the cemetery first changed hands and started being developed upon. But we today, have responsibility for accepting responsibility and dealing with it. Fred Hearns has lived in this community most of that time. I think he can relate personally to how citizens feel there. He has interviewed residents of ours that live on top of what is now known as Zion, and he can provide a lot more personal perspectives on I think the toll that it takes in the community. And then we're going to pivot to Tim, who's going to talk about how he can sort of take that knowledge and actually use it in coming up with a vision for the future, and a vision that everybody will be able to share. So Fred Hearns, if you can take it away now.
Thank you, Leroy, and good morning to everyone who's tuned into this program. This is an incredibly important discussion that we're having. I have to warn you, sometimes it could be a mistake to give a historian the microphone, but I'll try to stay within just a few minutes. I do have to tip my hat, as I always do, to Paul Guzzo. I call him Pulitzer Prize Paul for the work that he has done and continues to do. Real quickly, I need to go back to 1968. I was a sophomore at the University of South Florida in Tampa, and one of my white classmates invited me to a birthday party. It was on St. Pete Beach. And first time I'd ever really been on St. Pete Beach. Growing up in Tampa, as Leroy said, in a segregated community, we were not allowed to go to the beaches. I mean, here we are in the state of Florida, surrounded a peninsula by beaches, and we were kept away because of segregation from those beaches. So instead, we went to lakes up in northwest Hillsborough County, Walker's Lake, Keystone Lake. Those were our beaches. So I was very excited when I got invited to this party. I went to the party, and after I'd been there maybe 20 minutes, the young man who invited me said, Mr. Hearns, I don't know how to say this to you, but the man who owns the building called me and said, who invited that? And you can fill in the blank. I made up my mind that night after I left that party. One day I'm going to own some real estate over here as close to the beach as I can afford, and I'm going to live there. That was a promise I made to myself in 1968. So for the last 7 years, I've been living in St. Petersburg as close to the beach as I can afford to live. Rothstein's book really opens up a chapter in American history that I'm sure was very surprising to many people. When you learn that someone who we all hold close and dear in our memory of great presidents, those in the African-American community, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. But President Roosevelt had to make a lot of deals, like all powerful people do. If he wanted to maintain power, he had to, in many instances, appease the Southerners. And so we had this thing where out of it, the segregated policies came many things, and one of them was redlining, where different communities were literally circled with a red pin, and you don't sell to whites there. That's an area that African Americans only, or Black people, will live in, thus creating in some instances what some people call ghettos. But to me, growing up in a Black neighborhood in Tampa, that was pretty much all I knew. And guess what? To us, it was paradise. We knew all of our neighbors. Everybody respected everyone else. When we went into integrated spaces, it was usually a trip downtown, maybe for an hour or so to make a purchase, and then you went back to your neighborhood. or you went to some other area that was desegregated if you were allowed to, and then you went back to your neighborhood. But thank goodness we had people who were forward thinking, and with some of the laws that came down that broke up that system. For 15 years, I was human rights director for the city of Tampa. I worked for the city for over 32 years, but during those 15 years, from 1992 to 2007, I reviewed hundreds and hundreds of discrimination complaints based on violations or alleged violations of the Fair Housing Ordinance that the city of Tampa has. Today, we have weapons that we did not have back in the 50s when Zion was discovered, although it took quite a few other incidents before we're at the point now where we're actually doing something about Zion and the construction that took place on top of it. But now we have city ordinances, we have county ordinances, we have a state ordinance in the state of Florida, and we have the Federal Fair Housing Act passed in 1968. Rothstein writes about this quite a bit. And ironically, that was the same year I was ushered out of St. Petersburg near the beach because I was Black. There's a lot more I could say, but I do want to mention just a few people that I think we need to take a closer look at. And the name Richard Doby was mentioned. 1901 is when he actually founded the Zion Cemetery. He'd owned the property prior to that time, but as Leroy mentioned, his son is buried there, and many prominent people are buried there. We have actually one of the ancestors, or maybe more than one of the ancestors, of a name that you've all heard, Trayvon Martin, members of the Spofford family who lived in this area when it was called Robles Pond, P-O-N-D, reference to the lake at Robles Park playground that's just a stone throw away from Robles Park Village. So the Spotfords are buried there, ancestors of Trayvon Martin. And there are many other people, as Leroy said, who were not paupers, but they were Black. That's what they all had in common. Some of them originated from the Virgin Islands, and we find evidence of that in some of the shells and other things that Cardinal found at some of the grave sites. Some of these people were local folk who were business owners, who were very prominent in the community, who died and were buried. And I'm sure it was quite an honor to be buried in Zion Cemetery when it was an active cemetery, because, again, as Leroy said, it was in an area that no one really envisioned the city of Tampa would incorporate, which of course it did in the early 1930s, I think, when the area was incorporated into the city of Tampa. So again, I'll just close by saying, without rambling too much, I'm very excited that we're having this conversation. The Color of Law is a book I recommend to everybody. Came out in 2017. It will really open your eyes to the role that the federal government, as well as private developers, played in bringing about the racial segregation, discrimination that led to the Zion Cemetery being covered up or hidden. And we need look no further to know that this is a national issue, not just a local issue, than Manhattan in New York, where some 15,000 bodies of Africans who died in the 17 and 1800s were found back in 1992. And so we now have the African Burial Ground Memorial. We hope to do something on a smaller scale here in Tampa. I'm so happy to be a part of this process. Thank you, Leroy.
Hey, thank you, Fred. Thank you again for your personal sharing as well. And you just used the term cover up. Paul talked about when he first started writing his stories, they were intentionally using the word lost Zion. Then they moved to forgotten Zion. And I would like to quote Yvette Lewis, president of NAACP, who I think raises it to an even more intense level. Ignored cemetery. You know, these were willful, intentional. They knew the cemetery was there and they built upon it. They discovered bodies and they kept building. You know, no one ever stopped because they did not want to face the truth. And our next speaker, Tim, is reminding the community of the truth. As he's in our community every day, holding forums, both in person, socially distanced, but also a lot on social media and live feeds and in surveys. And he's developing not only a master plan for the redevelopment of Robles Park Village, which will now be the 35 acres minus 2.5 acres, but he's also developing a master plan for the Zion Cemetery Memorial Park. And so we are putting information out there, getting people's honest thoughts and perceptions on it. And he is now responsible with trying to synthesize all of that into what we expect to be an award-winning master plan for yet another best practice Tampa redevelopment. So Tim Baker, take it away.
Well, great. Thank you, Leroy, and it's my honor to be with the group this morning. You know, I can't help reflect that, you know, because of the proximity of Zion Cemetery to Robles Park redevelopment, you know, those two are run very parallel. So if the cemetery is an injustice that occurred, you know, some 70 years ago, that injustice and that systemic racism component exists every single day in the lives of the residents who live in Robles Park. So for us and for the team, it's not just about righting a wrong that was done 70 years ago. It's about looking carefully at how our work, how this project can change the systemic issues that exist in this community for the lives who live there in the generations to come. And so that's really been the honor of this project and a passion in our firm's work. And I think, you know, to talk about going forward, we have to talk a little bit about where we've come from. And, you know, many on the call, if you're a member of ULI, you know, we've all spent 25 years or so, you know, looking at blight, looking at urban revitalization and applying best practice standards to fix these neighborhoods. And, you know, it's everything from, you know, incorporating mixed income housing to developing transportation connectivity to re-establishing street grids with complete streets, to open space, to safety and security through SEPTEB principles, to public art, and the list goes on. And what I've sort of reflected on really in the last 5 to 7 years, when you look at these neighborhoods, they really have two outcomes. They either decline over time, so you insert a brand new neighborhood, but in 30 years, you're right back to where you started, or you create gentrification. And neither one of those were the intended outcomes. And I reflect on my own life, which brought me to some of these conclusions. You know, I grew up in a very poor household. I grew up in a white neighborhood. So, but I experienced poverty. But I had access to opportunity. I had a support group around me. Our family had support. We were always programmed for what tomorrow could bring and the opportunities. And it dawned on me as we started to work in some of these neighborhoods that poverty is not equal. And a lot of the systemic racial issues and the segregation policies that have occurred over time have created this inequity that prevents these groups from succeeding because there is no opportunity. and the lack of opportunity generationally creates a situation where neighborhoods decline, crime takes over. This idea that I can graduate from high school, or I can get a high-paying job, or I can raise my family. All of those things, which a lot of us take for granted, aren't even in the minds of the residents who live in these communities. They're day-to-day survival. And so it's interesting as we look at that issue and start to reflect, because it's 70, 80 years of disinvestment in these neighborhoods that create this decay. And when the disinvestment is there, also too is the opportunity is lost, and the future opportunities for families to grow and to thrive are gone. And so as we sort of start to look forward at Robles and other developments that we're working on, is absolutely, we're going to have all the best practices the ULI and New Urbanism has to offer in these communities. And they're going to be some of the best communities from an architectural and land planning perspective that there are. But where the majority of our focus is how do we restore opportunity and access to opportunity back to these neighborhoods. And so, we've really boiled it down to a very simple recipe that's been tested on a few projects, and the outcomes are successful. And it's really starts with people to create place, and then those people and places are infused with purpose. And so we start with people, and as Leroy mentioned on Robles, we've spent 3 months meeting all age groups, from 5-year-olds to 95-year-olds, and trying to understand what it is about the Robles neighborhood and that community. What is the culture and the history, and what is their DNA? Because every neighborhood is unique. You can't apply a one-size-fits-all or a generic sort of plan over top of a neighborhood. And then you have to get that neighborhood involved in the outcome and the leadership aspects. So it's their neighborhood. It's not my neighborhood. It's not Leroy's neighborhood. It's their neighborhood. And they should be sitting at the table on what that neighborhood looks like in the future and how they can manage and lead that neighborhood after we're long gone. And so really looking at the people aspect first is a very important component to kicking off the project. And then that understanding leads to place. And most of you on this call understand what placemaking is. And it's applying those best practice ULI standards to creating a wonderful master plan that incorporates those traditional ingredients that we talked about. The next piece that we've spent probably 80% of our time on this one relative to creating this master plan for Robles, and it's finding purpose. And so there are really 4 pillars that we've developed that we're trying to incorporate into Robles, and they're non-traditional things this group may not have thought about. So we're putting together a cradle to career education program for the residents of Robles. We're looking at a job and economic vitality program for the residents of Robles. We're looking at a health and wellness program for the residents of Robles. And we're addressing housing and sort of the basic needs of those residents, because you can't talk about the other 3 pillars unless you fix and solve just the basic needs of these individuals. And what we're doing with those 4 pillars is we're really surveying the community and redeveloping, realigning the deck chairs to create an ecosystem that's all interconnected, and that ecosystem, once you're in it, there's logic to move up. And so the idea is you move into this neighborhood, you access this ecosystem, and you have the opportunity to move up. And it's all about reestablishing access to opportunity for the residents of Robles. And we really don't see Robles as sort of a defined boundary. This is a neighborhood aspect. So if there's people that are 3 blocks away from Robles, they should have access to these opportunities, because what we found is poverty doesn't stop at a boundary or a street. And so the next concept that we're looking at relative to Robles is, and what we discovered with the residents, is it's extremely difficult for the residents to understand how to access the systems. Tampa Bay area has hundreds of nonprofits that are working tirelessly day and night to solve the problems of poverty and some of the issues that occur in the neighborhood. But the residents, it's a complicated sort of system to get involved. And that system, once you're in, you may solve a particular problem, but there's no continuum. You don't know or understand how to go to the next step. So what we're doing at Robles is we're creating this resource hub. And inside this neighborhood, these 4 pillars exist. And if you live in the neighborhood, literally all you have to do is walk through the front door. That is it. Walk through the front door. You'll immediately come to a concierge desk where there's navigators in each one of these pillars. And the navigators will customize the program for you and your family. So again, it's not sort of this generic blanket of services. It's customized specifically to the residents. And we're super excited. If you guys want to kind of do a deeper dive into this, we didn't make up these best practice principles. There's a group called Purpose Built Communities that has been doing this for quite some time. I think they've been around for almost 25 years. And there's some projects that are just unbelievable in the outcomes. One project that we've been involved with for 7 years, it's called Orlando Lift. And when you look at the outgoing metrics, childhood poverty is down 16%, per capita income is up 50%, crime is down 30%, high school graduation rates up 17%, kindergarten readiness up 12%, and resident satisfaction is at 88%. If you look at sort of the mothership of this program, it goes back almost 20 years to Eastlake in Atlanta. And so after 20 years, high school graduation rates are at 90%. Resident income is increased 5x. New private community investment is over 400 million. So investment is back into these neighborhoods, these thriving neighborhoods. Eligible adult employment is up to 100%. So if you want a job in this neighborhood, you have access to these jobs. And then finally, crime reduction is 99%. And so that's the goal going forward, not only for Robles, but I would challenge this group on any project, big or small, to look beyond what we've traditionally done with the ULI best practices and look at bringing opportunity and investment back into these neighborhoods. Because what happens is the residents take advantage of those opportunities and they create sustainable neighborhoods where they can live and grow for generations to come, instead of moving out to the next poorest neighborhood that they can afford to be in. So with that, Leroy, I'll kick it back to you. And again, thank you for this opportunity.
Hey, thank you. Thank you very much, Tim. And we've got about 8 minutes remaining for questions. So please start loading your questions in the chat box. I did see one question earlier that asked specifically for Tampa Housing Authority, why are we developing back mixed income communities? As you all know, Tampa Housing Authority owns a number of public housing sites. As we take down those sites, those are homogeneous, large, barrack style. Those are large acre sites because back in the 50s and 60s, they built back at a very low density. Just so happened that these sites today are part of the urban core. North Boulevard Homes, now West River, Encore Tampa, formerly Central Park Village. were communities that was built with single and two-story products. Now we can actually build 3, 4, and 5 stories. So we can build with greater densities, but we can also build back with greater diversity of uses as well, because we don't need as much land to replace the units down there. And our model has always been to actually increase the number of affordable units and add some market rate units and other uses on the same site. Why do we do that? One of the main reasons we do that, we never want to actually build back another pocket of poverty. Low-income units, don't typically support retail and the need for quality retail. You're not going to get a lot of public investment when you're just building for one population. You're only going to get the investments that target just that population. And these sites are in the downtown core. They lend themselves to a lot more, diversity of uses, retail and office. And, we've got museums going in and office buildings going in and grocery stores coming to the sites, and market rate units. Why market rate units? Because frankly, the people who live there do work. And some of them, as their income increases, they are forced to leave those communities because they're now over income. Once you get above the 80% of every median income, you can no longer live in public housing or Section 8. You gotta move into market rate housing. And they may love that community, but they're forced out of that community. Our typical model is to replace all of the affordable housing, increase the number of affordable housing, but then layer in some market rate units. At Encore, as an example, we have, all of our senior buildings are always 100% affordable. Our family buildings, we typically build back at 80% affordable, 20% market rate, or 70% affordable and 30% market rate. But what that has done is also generated a better market for quality grocers, quality retail. We've got a barbershop there. We've got a Head Start there. We've got a medical clinic there now. We've got an office operator there. The Urban League is actually on site there, renting office space now. We've got a grocery store coming to that site. We're working right now on 2 market rate buildings that's going to occupy that same site. So we build back diverse communities. We never want to repeat the problem of the past of building just for one segment of the population, but we have got to increase our portfolio of units that serve the low-income populations. I don't see any other questions lined up, but I did want to ask Paul a quick question. Paul, you mentioned that, this story just kept floating around there. You kept hearing this name, Ray Reid in particular, and that other people I'm sure have heard him say there's a cemetery there, but didn't take him seriously. Like you said, probably associated it with a conspiracy theorist. What was different? What finally resonated with you at hearing Ray Reid say there was a cemetery there? What made you get on this story?
When I saw the map, that we found it in the city directories, and then and it was a map. And I remember when I started reaching out to historians and saying, have you ever heard of Zion Cemetery? And I started reaching, for historians, from all over the state. And you're talking about people like Gary Mermino, Cantor Brown, the History Center. Also, we've never heard of Zion. That surprised me, because there was obviously once a Black cemetery there. And then when we just went into newspapers.com and I simply put for a keyword Zion Cemetery, and the first thing that came up when they found caskets while building Robles Park, and I realized, oh boy, there might be something to this. For me, it was just seeing that visual that somebody dug up caskets in the 50s and they didn't look for more. And I thought, well, there might be more there. And when I asked Rebecca O'Sullivan, who's now with Cardno, at the time she was with USF, FPAN, and I said, what are the odds that there are still more there? And she said, well, even if they moved the cemetery, if they found a few in 51, that means there's probably still there. They forgot some. So even if they moved it, there's likely still more bodies there. And that's really when we took this story seriously.
That's great. That's great. Okay, we do have one question from Carol. Carol asked the question, what are lessons from Robles Park that we can apply to other cemeteries in Tampa Bay. As you all know, we have had other discoveries in just our Tampa Bay market. But what are some of I'm going to ask that of each of the panel members just very quickly. What are some lessons that we've learned from Zion? Paul first.
Well, the sin's been committed. You can't go back and change that. I would say at least try to honor the people who are there and make up for the sins of the past. Nobody is alive who did what happened to Zion. But I mean, I think as you've shown, if you try to atone for those sins, people appreciate it, and it does help, mend that divide.
I love that. Love that, Paul. Thank you. Fred.
Well, I think all of us have a responsibility, not just elected officials, not just appointed officials, not just employees of firms or government agencies, but citizens have a responsibility. And that came out in some of the interviews I did with current residents of Robles Park when I asked the question, what can we do about this? How can we make sure this never happens again? And many of the residents said, well, we have to get involved. We have to ask questions. We have to make our voices heard. The big difference now is that we have people who are sensitive to these kinds of issues in public office. That makes a big difference. Not just African-American elected officials, even though we now have those at pretty much every level of government, but we have people who don't have that mentality of it's buried, let's leave it there. Even though I did have one former elected official, I think I mentioned this to you, Leroy, who said to me, why are you bringing all this up? He saw one of Paul's articles where I was quoted. And it was like, well, you may not feel that it affects you because this does not directly impact your community, your ethnic group, but it does impact all of us. My grandmother used to say a long time ago when she was living, what's done in the dark will come to light.
Right.
We now have some light shining on Zion, thank God.
That's right. Well said, Fred. And Tim, quickly.
I think obviously, as these cemeteries are discovered, I think understanding the rich history and memorializing that history and those memories. But I think the best thing we can do to right the injustice is to look at the neighborhoods and the residents that are still suffering and really work hard to bring back opportunity and investment into these neighborhoods, to change their trajectory of these lives. I will tell you, when we met with the residents and particularly the children within those residents, and I'm talking 5 to 8, I mean, there's still hope in their lives. They still see themselves as successful. And I think there would be no better way to right the wrong than to create opportunity and success for these children in these neighborhoods. And there's many.
Excellent. Well, thank you. And there's a few more questions. Will the project help the homeless in the community? It absolutely will. About 35% of our families that come off the wait list are identified as homeless, meeting the homeless criteria. Another question from Tareen Sabia, actually a statement. Tampa Heights neighborhood is one of the most diverse in the city. The neighborhood as a whole could help to support some of the pillars and initiatives. So we will be in touch with you, Tareen. I will definitely make sure that Tim gets your contact information. And unfortunately, we're out of time. Let me just wrap up by saying in large part, we better understand how systemic racism and segregation retarded generations of Black and brown citizens from participating in the American promise of health and prosperity. At ULI Tampa Bay, as we commit to building better and developing differently, it requires us to first understand the impact of past institutional patterns of unjust policies, more specifically, how systemic patterns of segregation has formed today's neighborhoods, cities, and society. Generations of lawmakers, planners, and industry professionals orchestrated a society where Blacks and whites were given disparate treatment, opportunities, and privilege, which today bear the fruit of racist beliefs, staggering societal disparities in health, wealth, education, and where we live. Today's discussion, I hope, has given you a more resolve than ever that creating more safe, healthy, livable, diverse communities start with understanding and accepting our industry's role, past, present, and future. In closing, and as we conclude today's program, please allow me to give you just a quick preview of the next two events. Next week, Thursday, February 25th at 8:30, Taylor Raff and Leonard Burke will be presenting the Beck and Invasion Partnership and their commitment to workplace, industry, diversity, equity, and inclusion. An incredible partnership that we see right here in our own community of larger majority-owned company partner with smaller minority-owned companies to actually start moving forward in a better way. And then the following Thursday, the third week, the final week of our 21-day Equitable Development Challenge, March 4th, Ernest Hooper will facilitate another candid conversation on equitable development and racial equity, this time centered on St. Petersburg and the discussion. And that discussion will also center around Manhattan Casino Project, Deuces Live, and the Warehouse Arts District. So please continue to stay active and complete your tasks under the 21-day challenge until the end. I'm sure you will not just learn much from this, but be empowered by the experience that this gives you as well. Thank you so much for joining us today. Have a great week.